You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management from a research-based perspective. All right, hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well, of course. I am, of course, as I said last week, back from traveling for a little while. I'll be traveling again here soon. March is going to be quite busy. So by the time you're seeing this, I will be just a little bit ahead of just ready to get into some travel after you hear this podcast. So if you have questions, comments, thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com, Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. If you have thoughts, criticisms, suggestions for new shows. In fact, today's show is a response to a comment that occurred on Facebook where there was some interest in learning a little bit more about the translocation and relocation of raccoons. And so I am doing that today. This is my second week on this particular subject, so get a little variety. If you're interested in learning more, go back and look at the previous week's podcast where we dealt with some part one on translocation, relocation of raccoons, part one. Well, this is part two. All right. Well, as you know, I have my website, Wildlife Control Consultant, and we have materials there that you can purchase. Also, if you're interested in learning about some of our training services and some of the other things that we provide, like ghostwriting, doing some research for you. Perhaps you'd like to have some help working on some of your PowerPoints if you're doing some training events so that they look professional. We'd love to talk to you. So you can reach me again at Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com. All right. Well, why don't we get right to it? Let me get my slideshow started here. And there we go. So we're in part two. All right. So let's just to sort of recap, we're talking about definitions here. Definitions, of course, are going to be critical for understanding this particular issue. And just to be sure you're aware of this, because not all wildlife control operators are as careful with their terminology as they should be. And I know there's a debate on this. I just disagree with it. I do believe that there is value in defining these two words differently rather than making them synonymous. Okay, so relocation, again, is the capture of an animal and then its release within its home range, right? So different animals have different home ranges. Let me give probably a classic illustration. You have a squirrel found in the basement of someone's house because it came through an uncapped chimney, perhaps, and is now in the basement. You capture that squirrel, then you relocate it to the backyard, right? So the squirrel is completely familiar with its surroundings because it lives around the house, right? It wouldn't have gotten into the house if it wasn't familiar with being near the house, right? So that is called a relocation. Now, taking that same squirrel and driving 15 miles and dumping it somewhere, that is translocation. We are now taking that squirrel outside of its familiar area and then releasing it. So now that it has to find new shelter, avoiding predators, trying to get things done before dark. Hopefully the weather is good and there's plenty of food sources and den sites, all the while trying to avoid predators. And of course, hopefully it's not sick or diseased to transmit the disease somewhere else. You can see there are challenges with translocation. So nevertheless, we're going to talk about some research that was done in the state of Illinois. And so here is the article. It is by Maya Mozillo, Edward J. Heskey, John D. Thompson, and the title of the article is Survival and Movements of Translocated Raccoons in North Central Illinois. And it was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, Volume 63, Issue 1, 278 to 286, and I believe it was published in 1994. I better take a look at that. Let me pause for a moment to see if I can find. I forgot to write down the year that it was ultimately done. So it was done in, 1999. All right, so I need to make sure that's understood there. So it was published in 1999. All right, so want to make sure that everyone is aware of that, right? So it was published in 1999. So let me repeat that again. So it's Maya Mozilla, Edward J. Heskey, John D. Thompson, in the 1999 article, Survival and Movements of Translocated Raccoons in North Central Illinois, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, Volume 63, Issue 1, pages 278 to 286. Now, this was a rather pretty big study that was done here. And so they were taking basically raccoons and radio collaring them. You can see some of the information here. They caught 31 nuisance raccoons in the fall of 1993, 45 nuisance raccoons in the fall of 1994. And what they had was they took urban raccoons, which were caught in suburban Chicago. Then they had resident raccoons that were caught in Lone Grove Forest Preserve. And the Forest Preserve raccoons, I need to just ignore that bottom part, but they basically divided the raccoons into 3 groups. So just to give you some more data on the captured animals that they had, so they had 1993, they had 15 male raccoons and 16 female raccoons. And they monitored those raccoons for 45 to 77 days. In 1994, they captured 23 male raccoons and 22 female raccoons, and they monitored them anywhere from 50 to 107 days. Again, they were using radio collaring, and they were tracking what these raccoons were doing, because recall the title, they're taking these raccoons and moving them and then tracking their survival, what happens to them. Now, the raccoons that they captured were divided into 3 groups. So the resident raccoons were caught in the rural area, sort of a preserve, and then they released those animals within 500 meters of their capture location, sometimes right on the same site. Rural raccoons were translocated to the urban area, right, like Chicago. So we have these rural ones were captured outside of the preserve area. And then the urban raccoons, which were caught outside the Chicago area, they were translocated to the rural area. So you can see they're trying to see what happens with animals when they're being moved to habitats they're not always familiar with. Here are the results. So we have the fates of radio-collared raccoons trapped and released at Lone Grove Forest Preserve, Kane County. These were the residents. Then they trapped in another wooded area and translocated to the forest. These were the translocated rurals. So I'm sorry, I have that wrong. So it was actually rural raccoons translocated to another rural area. And then they trapped nuisance wildlife and those were urban, and they translocated them to a rural area. So I had that wrong. Make sure that's correct. So what were the results of what happened? So again, they were tracking these particular animals. These animals were caught basically in the fall. September, I think some were done in July, were done earlier. So August to November, and they were monitoring them. And notice what we had. So the resident animals, 7 survived, 3 died in 1993. None of them disappeared. Now, disappearing, one of the challenges whenever you're doing radio collaring is that sometimes animals, you lose them, right? And so they're lost for various reasons. Sometimes it's simply the raccoon or animal is able to get the collar off its neck and it drops it somewhere. Other times it's because the animal dies or is taken, or just simply you have a malfunction in the collar. Technology always has its challenges. But nevertheless, so when you see disappeared, they often don't know what happened. Sometimes they know what happened to them, sometimes they don't. Even when they know they died, sometimes they don't know exactly what caused their death either. So it's field work is tough, okay? So cut them some slack here, okay? So translocated rural, again, they were taken from a rural environment, moved to a different rural environment. You had 7 survived, 2 died. And then translocated urban, you had 5 that survived and 2 died. 3 disappeared, 2 disappeared respectively. Two disappeared in the translocated rural. Overwintering, the residents had 5 survived, 1 died, 1 disappeared. Translocated rural, you had 5 survived, 1 died, 1 disappeared. In the translocated urban, you had 4 survived, 1 died, and none disappeared. Numbers are relatively similar to 1994. So you have a little bit more mortality, of course, but you also had more raccoons. And you had a little bit more disappearance. Of course, it was over a longer period of follow-up, right? So the longer the study goes, the longer you're following, the more likely something's going to go wrong, right? In terms of collars being pulled off and what have you. Nevertheless, things are looking pretty good there. What the researchers found was that the survival rate amongst the 3 groups, now remember what those 3 groups were. You had animals that were resident, that's animals that were caught in the forest preserve and basically released within, I think it was 400 meters or 500 meters of their capture site. That's the resident area. And you had the translocated rural, that's where they captured some animals near outside of the forest preserve and then moved them into the forest preserve. And so that's going to be translocated rural. Then you had animals that were captured in suburban Chicago and they were moved into the area around the forest preserve. The survival rate of all 3 groups was what they would call statistically similar. In other words, there was no indication that the differences in numbers was anything different than random chance, okay? What they also found was that 75 to 80% of all the translocated raccoons, we're not talking about the resident raccoons here, we're talking about the translocated raccoons, it's only 2 of the 3 groups, 75 to 80% of them survived at least 2 months following their release. And so what was interesting among this research that they commented on was that their survival rates were higher than those of other studies. So others, of course, as I said previously in last week's podcast, researchers, when they're doing a particular study, they're interacting with research that has gone on before, and they're trying to compare their findings with the research done elsewhere. And what they found was that the survival among their raccoons that were translocated was higher than what other researchers found. And so they had some suggestions as to why that took place. The reason was, they believe, was that the period of time they were doing this work, the weather was relatively good. In other words, it's one thing to be translocated during good weather versus, sub-freezing or sub-zero temperatures that go on for a month, right? Probably if that occurred during their study period, their mortality rate would have probably been significantly higher, but that may have even occurred among the resident raccoons, right? But we don't know. Another reason why they thought they had a high survival rate was that the raccoons had abundant food. And so food, of course, is critical. Animals can deal with a lot of different stresses provided they have enough food resources available to give them the energy they need to survive. But nevertheless, this particular study was different from a lot of other studies where mortality rates among translocated animals was significantly higher. But what they did find, however, was that almost all the translocated raccoons moved from their release site at least more than half a mile. And some of them moved dramatically. So they had three of the raccoons that traveled 15 miles. One raccoon traveled, three total here. So we had one raccoon that moved 15 miles, one that moved 15 and a half miles, one that moved 37.3 miles. And by the way, when we say move that many miles, they use direct line miles. They're not tracking the raccoon in terms of how many steps it had. They're just saying, this is where we found the raccoon, this is where it was released, and they draw a straight line between them. Now think about how far that is for an animal to move in a straight line. Now, raccoons don't move in straight lines, right? They're not marathon runners. They're going up and down things. They're going, they're roaming around, going in circles. And so it traveled actually a lot farther than that if we took that actual route and stretched it out into a string, right? But nevertheless, from where it was released to where they ultimately tracked it, was 37.3 miles for one of those raccoons. In contrast, raccoons that were called resident, that is, raccoons that were released within their home range, basically stayed in their home range. So there's something disorienting to an animal when like a raccoon, when you're letting it go into an area where it is not familiar, it tends to move rather dramatically. Let me illustrate with one of their charts. Now, hopefully you're not driving, so you can pause and take a look at this, maybe blow it up on your phone if you're watching with your phone. Now, notice what we're looking at here in terms of the vertical column is the number of raccoons. And then on the horizontal row, you have the distance from the release point where they found these raccoons, where they moved to, right? And so you have 1993 results on the top, 1994 results on the bottom. And there's three columns, right? So just the clear column was the resident, and you're only going to see basically one of those. The black column is the translocated rural raccoons. That is a raccoon that was captured in a rural environment, translocated and released in a rural environment. And then the slashed columns are the translocated urban. Those were the ones that were captured outside of Chicago and then moved into a rural environment. Notice what we see here. When you look at those slashed columns, only let's look at 1994 because there's more data and but it's still similar to what occurred in 1993. If you look at the far left, you'll notice that they had two raccoons that stayed within 1 kilometer. Now remember, a kilometer is just a little bit more than half a mile. It's like 0.6 miles. But when you start moving to the right, you'll notice that they had one raccoon that moved almost a mile. They had two raccoons that moved about 2 miles. They had another raccoon that moved about 3.5 miles. You had another raccoon that was moving about 4 to 5 miles. And then it keeps going out. Notice how they had two raccoons that moved. These are the translocated urban that moved more than 20 kilometers. That means over 10 miles. The bottom line here is that translocated animals, whether they're urban or rural animals, as far as raccoons are concerned, they don't like it. They're moving around, probably trying to reorient themselves to their new area. Maybe they're trying to get back. Now, you notice last week, the research done out of New York was just trying to find out why raccoons homed, which would mean how did they figure their way back to the original capture site. Much smaller study, but notice raccoons would travel some distances to come back, and many of them did. And here's an example of where these raccoons are just disoriented and they're trying to figure out where they're at. So what do we do with all this information? Number one, we need to realize that translocated raccoons, uh, they're trying to figure out how to get back, where they're at, what they're doing. We also found from this research that translocation is not necessarily a death sentence because the researchers found that there really wasn't any greater mortality difference between translocated animals and non-translocated animals. With this caveat, you need to recognize that wherever you're dumping an animal, is it a location that's suitable for their habitat, that they're familiar, that they have suitable habitat. In other words, raccoons, are there enough den trees in the area? What's the density of raccoons in that particular area that you're dumping raccoons into? Is there enough food resources in that area? What kind of weather conditions are there? Is the animal that you're translocating, how healthy is it? Now, that's something you're not going to be able to know. It may look fine, but is it fine, right? If it looks bad, it's bad, but if it looks fine, it doesn't mean it's fine. So your results, don't just simply assume that your translocation of an animal is going to be as humane or as the animal is going to survive as long as what happened in this Illinois study, because you can't predict the weather. But you can improve the chances of the survivability of that raccoon by finding locations where there are suitable food resources and enough den sites. But then you also have to think about, how humane is that? Okay. Is there going to be a disease transfer? This is why you need to kind of look your animal over and say, does it have pus around its eyes? Does its hair look all mangy and what have you? Does it look like it's in good condition? Does it look lethargic? Okay, does it have injuries? And you need to be thinking about that. Not every release is going to be more humane than death. There are things worse for an animal than death. What are the legalities? Of course, you always want to make sure you're never translocating or releasing animals without the legal permission to do so. So make sure you're following state laws when you're handling this sort of thing. Even in situations where you have the choice, you need to be thinking about, is my translocation of an animal appropriate? Do you have permission for the relocation site? Don't just simply assume you have the permission to dump it on state land or federal land, because you may not. Right? So this is a problem even in my own home state here, where people will take an animal and they'll dump it on state land or dump it on federal land. And do they have permission to do that? And they need permission in order to do that, right? So don't just simply assume that everything's going to be fine. Will the animal become a nuisance in a new area is something else you have to consider. Now, as America becomes more populated, there are less and less areas that are just free forest, right? So understand that a raccoon, you may release it at point A, thinking that it's got plenty of resources there available for it, but that doesn't mean it's not going to move 10 miles. Remember, that's 10 miles as the crow flies, and then become a problem for someone else. Don't simply believe that there's these empty places in America that are just saying, bring us your raccoons. It's just simply not true. Now, there are going to be places that have maybe more hunting pressure. Perhaps you can release these raccoons in areas where people hunt every fall. So they're reducing the number of raccoons in that particular area. That would probably be a good spot, right? So you're not going to be making more raccoons more abundant in that area than others. So, is translocation of raccoons always a death sentence? The answer is no, but there are other things to keep in mind, such as if the weather conditions are right, if the animal is healthy, if there are abundant food resources and shelter resources. You want to move animals. If you're going to translocate them, move them to an area that the habitat sort of matches where you captured them, right? Don't take a squirrel from a forest and drop it in a desert, right? Don't take a squirrel from a forest and drop it into a swamp, okay? So make the animal move the animal to an area that it's going to be more familiar with. Now, With wildlife that are nuisance in urban areas, that's going to be a little bit of a problem because now you're moving it from an urban area to a rural area. That may not be as big of a change, however, provided the rural area has sufficient food resources for it. Yeah, you can see, man, as I said before, a simple lie is easier to believe than a complex truth. And so you can see the variables involved here. But try to give your animal a good shot. Even the time of day that you release is important, right? So releasing a nocturnal animal closer to dusk is a better idea than releasing it early in the morning. Same way with a squirrel. You don't want to release a squirrel. A diurnal squirrel, like a gray squirrel, fox squirrels, they come out during the day. You want to release that squirrel in the morning so it has daylight to find new resources. Don't simply go out and release it just before nightfall. Very stressful on an animal. So think about that when you're doing this sort of work. I'll probably do some more work in the area of translocation, relocation, so stay tuned for future ones. And of course, do subscribe to the podcast. We'd love to have you. And of course, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, even suggestions for new shows, we do welcome guests on our show, but I do ask that you take a few moments to look up we have a podcast on how to be a guest on the show. Do take a few moments to listen to that. And then, of course, you can reach out to me if you're interested in being on the show. We'd love to talk to you and the opportunity to have you on the show. We think there's a lot of information out there in the world to try to get out there to the public because we don't think communication information moves very well in the wildlife control community, and we want to make sure we're helping get that information out. Again, you've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management from a research-based perspective. Hope you enjoyed the show, and until next time, take care, everyone. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.